case control study is used to examine the relationship of an exposure to a certain disease. So the objective of a case control study is to compare the two groups, cases and controls. Cases are the individuals with the disease, and controls are the ones without the disease. The primary question of a case control study is, do cases and controls have different exposure histories? Case control studies are used when the disease of interest is uncommon, but there is a reasonable amount of people with the disease. There are 4 steps to a case control study. First is to identify a source of cases or people with the disease. Next is to assign a case definition. This definition states the exact characteristics that must be present or absent for it to be considered a case. Next is to decide how the controls will be chosen. And last is to decide if the cases and controls will be matched. All cases must have the same disease. The controls can come from people in the community, people from the same hospital, school rosters, anything as long as it has something in common with the case. Recall bias is a common problem in case control studies. This comes from cases and controls having different memories of how things may have happened. The form of measurement used is the odds ratio. This is the odds of exposure for each group. This is calculated by A times D divided by B times C, where A are the cases with exposure, B are the controls with exposure, C are the cases with no exposure, and D are the controls with no exposure. This can be set up in a 2x2 table. If the exposure for each group is the same, then the odds ratio will equal 1. If the odds ratio is greater than 1, then the cases have more chance of exposure than the controls, meaning that the exposure was risky or that it probably caused the disease. If the odds ratio is less than 1, then the cases have lower odds of exposure than the controls, meaning the exposure was protected. The 95% confidence interval determines if the odds ratio is statistically significant. For an odds ratio to be statistically significant, it must be less than 1, or it can be greater than 1. The odds ratio is not statistically significant if the confidence interval is less than 1 on one end, but higher than 1 on the other end. Then this means there's no association between the exposure and the disease. Case control studies use 3 types of matching: no matching, frequency matching, and matched pairs. No matching is when we just hope the cases and controls compare based on age, sex, socioeconomic status, etc. Frequency matching is using groups such as hospitals, nursing homes, schools, anything like that. Matched pairs means for every case chosen, there's also a control chosen to go along with it. My reference for this PowerPoint was our book, Introduction to Health Research Methods, a Practical Guide.